So season 4 of The Last Kingdom came out a week ago, and as you know, if you've been watching the channel for a little while, I am a huge fan. Do you mind? Sorry. I am a huge fan of this show. In fact, my first video was a response to Lindy Beige, who made a video criticising some of the aspects of the first episode, which is still a quality video. And I might make some more videos on The Last Kingdom and some of the accuracy and history around that as well. But that's for another time. This video is about this guy. This is Edward. Now, he's King Edward at this point. He's known to history as Edward the Elder, and his reign starts in the year 900. Now, we actually already saw this in the previous season, season 3. Yes, there will be spoilers in this video, so if you don't want to know what happens in season 4, then I suggest you don't watch, because, well, I'm going to be talking about it. I have an issue with the way that Edward is portrayed in this 4th season of The Last Kingdom, and this video is basically going to break down what I think they got wrong, historically speaking, about his character. And this starts right from the first scene in the first episode involving Edward. And the first point that I want to bring up is that throughout this season, Edward is basically not very nice to his mother, who is Ealhswith, who was married to Alfred. She's also the mother of Æthelflæd. And actually, there is a real problem with this, with the historical Edward, because by this point, we have a rough dating of this. It's got to be after the year 902, when the Battle of the Holm was fought. That's when Æthelwold is killed. That's what we saw at the end of the last season. But Ealhswith died before the Battle of the Holm was fought, so whatever date this season starts with, she is actually already dead at this point. So the historical Edward couldn't have been neglecting his mother and ordering his mother to be locked up after the year 902 when this season is, because she was already dead. And a similar thing applies for this guy, the guy on the left, Æthelhelm, who we've all really grown to hate this season because he is, you know, a very scheming, conniving little man. But actually, historically speaking, this Elderman probably was not potentially that significant, certainly not for Edward the Elder, because he was most likely already dead before he came to the throne. Now, there are several Æthelhelms, which is a bit of a tricky situation. Most likely he is based on the Ealdorman Æthelhelm of Wiltshire, who fought with Alfred at the Battle of Buttington in 893. He's recorded in several other places. Now, it's possible that he's actually the older brother of this chap who died in the last season. This is Æthelwold, and that they are then related. Now, to explain who these figures are, we don't actually see this Æthelhelm in the series. This is because the Alfred's father, so King Alfred's father, King Æthelwulf, his brother Æthelred, we do see him in sort of the second episode of the first season. He's the King of Wessex at that point. He has two sons, Æthelhelm, who is the elder, and Æthelwold, and of course we do see Æthelwold in The Last Kingdom, who mounts the rebellion against Edward. Now, of course, Alfred has his son, King Edward, and then it's Æthelhelm's daughter, Æthelflæd. Now, we know that Alfred's father, who Edward marries, and we see that at the end of the last season, was called Æthelhelm, but we're not sure which Æthelhelm it was, if it was this Æthelhelm of Wiltshire, or this Æthelhelm who was the son of King Æthelred. And I realise this is incredibly complex sounding. It is a bit complex to wrap your head around, but they might be one and the same. This Ealdorman of Wiltshire, we know that this other Æthelhelm, unlike his younger brother, did not rebel against Alfred and towed the line, and was granted a lot in Alfred's will when Alfred died. And so it might be the case that it also then makes sense for them to marry, but what that does mean is that Edward has married his first cousin, which is a little bit dodgy, but I guess the practice didn't continue, which is why the next kings looked fairly normal and had normal-sized noses and such. But what that does mean, again, is that, well, yeah, essentially it kind of makes sense, because then they would be reunifying these two branches of the family, especially as Æthelwold was much more bent on rebellion, as he did in 902, which we saw at the end of the last season. So that's a possibility. The problem is that both of these Æthelhelms, or if it was the one and the same, he was already dead before Alfred had died. He predeceased Alfred. So again, we can't be seeing him, historically speaking, manipulating and controlling Edward, because he was already dead. So what have we learned so far? Edward can't have been manipulated and controlled by Ealdorman Æthelhelm because he was already dead, and it doesn't seem that there was another Ealdorman that the show has simply pasted Æthelhelm on top of that was doing this. In fact, it seems very much that Edward was acting on his own volition. Furthermore, he can't have excluded his mother because she was already dead by the time of the Battle of the Holm, which was the end of Season 3. So there's none of this locking up his mother and being a bad son, because she was already dead. And actually the evidence that we have suggests he was quite a good son and trusted her advice. As it says in Edward the Elder, King of the Anglo-Saxons by Michael John Key, Edward's relationship with his mother remains a closed book, but from the little that is known about her, she was probably highly influential in Edward's development and supportive during his early days of replacing his father. Ealhswith was never permitted the title Queen, but referred to instead as the King's wife. This is a very common feature in the West Saxon tradition. For the Mercians, however, the Mercian wives of kings are referred to as queens. So there's a different relationship between women in Mercia and Wessex, which does explain as well why they were much more ready to accept Æthelflæd as Lady of the Mercians, because they saw women differently than the West Saxons, which is interesting. But to finish the quote, more remarkably, however, is that she does not, this is referring to Ealhswith, his mother, does not show up as a witness in any of Alfred's surviving charters, although she does appear in one of her sons in 901. It seems at least that Edward valued his mother's advice at court. So she does testify to one of Edward's charters, but never to Alfred, so potentially even she has more of a say in the power of Edward's early court when in the last year of her life, 901, than she ever did with her husband. Now this next scene really annoyed me from a historical point of view, and this is Uhtred's proposal to get Bebbanburg back. And I'm just going to go through some of the things. This honestly deserves a video in and of itself, because the idea, historically speaking, is absolutely ridiculous. The conversation goes something like this between Father Purelig, Edward and Uhtred. They all commit heinous crimes against the historical situation. So the first point that's raised is that the Scots are attacking Northumbria. Now, this in itself isn't quite right, because the Scots are attacking the northern part of Northumbria at this time. Edinburgh had been under Northumbrian control since the middle of the 7th century. It's around this time in the middle of the 9th century that the Scots, the Kingdom of Alapa, as it should actually be called at this point still, Gaelic-speaking kingdom, Pictish, is disappearing at this point from the written record. They started to push south into the area past the Firth of Forth, into the area of now Edinburgh, Lothian, and further still, and that's what we see at the start of the season. And he says, well, they'll attack again in number. Now, first of all, that's not any of their concern, because they're in Wessex. He then goes on to say, capturing Bebbanburg will be your foothold in Northumbria. And then, I take Northumbria and I unite the 4 kingdoms. That's Edward saying that. Then there's just the small matter of conquering East Anglia. Your father knew it could be done, 1 country, 1 king, unless you want the Scots to gain a foothold to attack you from.
I'm sorry, you've got to be fucking kidding.
The best way to explain this is probably a map of the situation in the early 900s for Edward, because basically what they're talking about is the Scots and Bebbanburg, which are up there where the arrows are. You know, the territory of the Scots isn't even on the map. It's north of the area that was under the control of the Bernician magnates. Bebbanburg is right the way up there. Now you can see Edward and where they are is in Winchester in Wessex. There's all this Danish territory between there and Bebbanburg. So how on earth are they going to use that as a foothold in Northumbria when there is so much land, essentially enemy land, that was controlled by various polities that are now grouped together under the term Danelaw? How on earth are they going to use that? And how on earth are the Scots, who are all the way up there, remember, even if they take Bebbanburg, which is right in the north there, going to use that as a base to attack Wessex from? Because they have to get through all of the Danish territory, all of Mercia, and then attack Wessex. It makes incredibly little sense. And quite frankly, Edward is right for not supporting that venture up there. That is not in his best interest. There's also the whole fallacy of uniting the 4 kingdoms and the vision of England and all of these kind of things, and sort of pitting the Anglo-Saxons on one side against the Danes on another side. And this is pretty... it's not very well supported by the historical documentation. Remember that the West Saxons had never controlled somewhere as far north as Bebbanburg. Bebbanburg was really far in the north, part of the Kingdom of Bernicia and Northumbria originally, and actually Edward the Elder is the first of the kings to get control over land that the West Saxons had never had control over before, when he goes on his Danelaw campaign into East Anglia, for example. But this idea of creating a foothold in Northumbria from which to unite a kingdom that has never before been united, and the idea of which was probably not in Edward's mind in 902, because, well, his father had fought defensively against the Danes the whole time. Maybe later in Edward's reign it became more feasible, but at this point it certainly was not. So one of the things I find really annoying about their portrayal of Edward in this season is that they show him as this reactive victim who doesn't take anything on his own initiative, he's indecisive, and he never wants to move against the Danes, only wants to stay at home in Wessex, which he doesn't even do in the end. And this really isn't what we see at all in the historical record of Edward the Elder. Certainly not if you compare what he started off with and then the expanse of his territory when he was complete and the level of integration of, for example, Mercia into Wessex and the administration and things like this. Now, the Last Kingdom's chronology of a lot of the events make it seem like Edward is the victim, that he doesn't do anything, he's just reacting to what the Danes are doing, basically playing by their tune. Basically what happens is that Ealdorman Æthelred, who's in charge of Mercia, he leaves Mercia completely empty. I'm always surprised that they don't leave garrisons behind in the Last Kingdom, it's a bit strange. And then he attacks East Anglia based on a rumour which turns out to be false later on. So the Danes invade Mercia with Æthelred gone, they sack Aylesbury in an attempt to draw Edward out from Wessex because Edward's got to help Mercia because Æthelred... Yeah. So Edward is indecisive, so Æthelflæd goes to Mercia to force Edward to go to Mercia because she's in Mercia, and then gets the Welsh involved instead because Edward won't go to Mercia because Æthelflæd went to Mercia, but Edward does arrive but then doesn't take part in the battle because the Welsh... Yeah, so basically that's the chronology in the Last Kingdom. Now the historical chronology is really quite different, and that's because they've skipped a huge step of this whole campaign leading up to the Battle of Tettenhall, which is that if you read the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, you'll see that in the year 909, it's Edward that goes on the offensive. He's not reacting. And from the year 909, this is from the A manuscript, so the one written in Winchester, contemporary manuscript, it says, "And the same year King Edward sent an army both from Wessex and from Mercia, and it raided the North raiding army," those are the Danes in the north, "very greatly, both men and every kind of property, and killed many of those Danish, and were inside there for 5 weeks." So it's Edward that goes on the offensive. Edward raids into the Danelaw, probably areas of East Anglia and the Northern Midlands, the area politically called the Five Boroughs at this point. And this is very different. It's not Æthelred going off, and Æthelred, that's another huge bone I have to pick with this show, is that Æthelred probably was quite a nice guy. And he probably had a really good relationship with Æthelflæd. That's at least what we see. They seem to be working together. It's probably thanks to Æthelred that Æthelflæd is accepted as Lady of the Mercians without so much trouble. But the show, and I realise why, if you read the books, Bernard Cornwell even says Æthelred was probably quite a nice guy, just make him a bit of a meanie because it makes for more interesting reading, which is fair enough. But basically that completely changes the chronology of events. It's not Æthelred going out and leaving Mercia completely open and then Edward has to act. It's actually Mercians and the West Saxons who are taking the initiative and throw the first punch, essentially. And actually the throwing of this first punch, this raid, it was to Barnsley, which is, was it Barnsley? I think Bardney, sorry, in Lincolnshire, and this was to recapture the relics of St Oswald. Now, St Oswald was a 7th century Northumbrian king, very interesting guy. I'll have to make a video about him at another point, but he was highly revered in Northumbria, but also in Mercia and later on in Germany and Switzerland and across Europe as well. And so this was actually a mission to capture these holy relics and to bring them into Mercia / Wessex, into this area of joint control, and that's what this 909 raid was kind of the pretext for. So again, if we go back to the historical chronology, Edward strikes the first blow in 909. Then it's as revenge that the Danes from Northumbria, which is what the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle suggests, but Dawn Hadley, actually based on coinage evidence and the names of the kings who are killed, suggests that it was those from the Northern Midlands rather than Northumbria, but they mount a raid into Mercia. And of course, in the show, it's Edward is, what, the Danes are attacking, and he has no idea, and he says, well, there was peace and I'm just going to sit behind my walls and now I have to act, and his mother and his sister force him to do something. But in actuality, he was much more prepared. If you look at what happens, if we read the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle again, that should be 910, sorry, it says, "And the king had gathered some 100 ships and was then in Kent, and the ships went east along the south coast towards him," that's the raiding army. "Then the raiding army imagined that the most part of his reinforcement was on these ships, and that they might go unfought wherever they wanted. Then when the king learned that they had gone out on a raid, he sent his army both from Wessex and from Mercia," again, that phrase, the West Saxons and the Mercians working together, not Æthelred pretending pretending to be a king going off somewhere and, trying to overthrow them and all of this, but working together in tandem against the Danes. And they got in front of the raiding army from behind it when it was on its way home, and then fought with them and put the raiding army to flight, and killed many thousands of it. King Ealhswith was there. The other kings that are killed, by the way, if you're interested, are Halfdan and Ingvar. So again, this is a completely different response from the historical record that we see, and this is the Battle of Tettenhall as it's recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. It's Edward who was, at that time, we also have evidence for his large navy at this point. He sails around and manages to trap this raiding army that had come for revenge from his initial raid the year before, which is, again, completely different to what we see in the show, where he's, just reacting and does something at the last minute and really doesn't pay off. Now, I really liked the fact that they brought in the Welsh. It was really cool to see another of the cultures. I don't know quite why they're LARPing as Romans, but apart from that, it was really cool to see the Welsh, and really cool that there was even, it was just one phrase in Welsh, but it was nice to get that in there. But actually at Tettenhall, we don't have any evidence that the Welsh were fighting at Tettenhall, which is a shame because we do get evidence that the Welsh get involved in this period. In 911, for example, we have the submission of some of these Welsh kings. I think it's Rhodri, who is the king of Deheubarth, and there's the king of Gwynedd as well. They both submit to Æthelflæd, basically recognizing her status above them. And in 914 as well, we get this great raid that we read about in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, that one of a Welsh bishop is captured, and it's Edward who pays the ransom for the bishop and releases him back to the Welsh, so it's working together. And in 918 again, we get that they submit to Edward as their overlord, these kings in Wales. Hywel as well, who is the famous king who they call King Howell in this. He had very famous law codes. It's what he's famous for. So again, in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle we read, he, that is Edward, rode and took the stronghold at Tamworth, and all the nation of the land of Mercia, which was earlier subject to Æthelflæd, turned to him, and the kings of Wales, Hywel and Clydog and Idval, and all the race of the Welsh sought him as their lord. So that's again the A manuscript written in Winchester for the year 918, when Æthelflæd dies. So that's them working together with Edward at this point, and we do later on read that when Edward is fighting in Mercia towards the end of his reign, that he's supported by the Welsh. So that's the Welsh getting involved. So that is historical, just not for the Battle of Tettenhall. It happened a little bit later. So again, the idea of Edward being reactive and forced by his mother and his sister to seek this alliance with the Welsh and giving them all the spoils from Tettenhall doesn't follow the historical record at all. And actually it seems to be the other way around, that the Welsh were recognising the English, whether that be the Mercians under Æthelflæd and Æthelred, or later on Edward as well, as we saw in 918, as their overlords and as submitting to them. Now, of course, we do need to remember that we get this from the Mercian register of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle for Æthelflæd, and the common stock for the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle for Edward. So, of course, they are more likely to say, oh yes, of course, they got the submission of all these nations. But it does seem to be the case at this point. Now, that does mean that we can date this season roughly, because the Battle of Tettenhall we know was in 910. So we can date basically things that happened before the Battle of Tettenhall as happening between 902 and 910, which, in all honesty, not that much happens in terms of fighting in Edward's reign. And also what comes after as sort of 911, 912. Now, 911 is the year in which Æthelred dies, which we do see in the show. But what we then see is, several episodes of Edward hanging around in Aylesbury, and it's kind of like a foreign occupation in a way, with him sort of nooting around Aylesbury, building up defences and kind of trying to influence the politics of Mercia, which is basically independent. But we don't really have any evidence that there was this great big power struggle when Æthelred died. Really, Æthelflæd just kind of went on as the Lady of the Mercians, and actually we do have evidence that it might have been from the Battle of the Holm or an earlier engagement that Æthelred was suffering some kind of sickness. It's been interpreted as well as an injury from battle, which we do see, fair play to the show, that he gets this head injury in the Battle of Tettenhall, but actually this was much earlier that he already had this kind of injury or sickness, and meant that Æthelflæd was actually the one taking charge. So that's already way before Æthelred dies, which potentially again smoothed the transition for her to be the recognised leader. Also because actually, unlike what we see here, Edward is sort of very much against Æthelflæd becoming leader of the Mercians. And I have to question, well, why? She's his sister. That gives Mercia basically right under West Saxon dominion in a way. Not to say that, of course, Edward had control in Mercia. It was pretty autonomous at this point. They are subject to Mercia, so Æthelred doesn't refer to himself, as far as we know, as King of the Mercians. He's called Ealdorman, so that's a role subservient to the king, which was Alfred before him and Edward now. And actually what we should maybe see is actually some action happening in London, because the interesting thing that happens on Æthelred's death is that Edward makes London part of the West Saxon sphere of influence. Basically, that comes under his control at this point, and charters and things there are in his name, and not Ealdorman Æthelred, who has died, or Æthelflæd. So that's something that we don't see, but he's just kind of sitting in Aylesbury in the show and trying to influence the politics. Now, to quote again from Edward the Elder by Key, he says, "The dynamics between Edward and Æthelflæd may have been straightforward, but the evidence from the forthcoming campaigns against the Danelaw shows that Edward did not interfere in internal Mercian affairs and allowed Æthelflæd, if it is assumed he had a choice, she may of course have been powerful and said, no, I'm doing this, and that Edward just respected that, a free hand during this period," which is unlike what we see in the show. Whatever arrangement there was between them, their strategy against the Danes followed a similar pattern. Edward's overall strategy relied at first on the cooperation of his sister, and as time passed, the coordinated warfare that later emerged against a shared enemy. In turn, Mercia also needed support from Edward, and to recover Mercian territory on its eastern borders, it would be necessary for the siblings to cooperate. Whether this extended to a central command under Edward is less likely. So what we see when we read the sources like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, where burhs are being built, etc., charters, we see that they're working together. Probably not Edward's trying to control Æthelflæd, but that they have a common goal, which is to keep their borders safe, to build bwrs around them, or bwyri, the plural in Old English, and to retake, I shouldn't say retake. For the Mercians, it was retaking part of Mercia, but for Edward, it was invading East Anglia. East Anglia had been a different kingdom; it had not been part of Wessex, and so this was a conquest rather than a reconquest, which is something that I think the show doesn't address particularly well. Now, the final point, because I feel this video is already getting very long, is just the ridiculous siege that Edward does of Winchester. Now, first of all, Winchester did not fall during Edward's reign. Edward really had the Danes on the back foot, and sure, they tried to invade, but he built so many bwyri on the coast. He actually potentially did a better job than Alfred in some ways, because he had more troops out in the field, and he negotiated much more harshly with the Danes. Alfred would often pay the Danes, who would then come back. Edward never paid the Danes. He ransomed that Welsh bishop, but he never paid the Danes to go away, and actually, even though he'd ransomed that bishop, he knew that that fleet of Danes would come back and attack, so he had those southern defences strengthened, and sure enough, the next week they attacked and they were repulsed with huge losses on the Danish side. So Edward was very savvy in his fighting. He underwent quite a few sieges, but most of the time all he had to do was march up to one of these defended towns in the Five Boroughs, for example, in East Anglia, and the Danish army would surrender and submit to him, like you see at Bedford or Cambridge and elsewhere. These armies, these towns seem to have had armies that belonged to them, Danish armies that had come, he would have integrated at this point with the local population. They would simply surrender to Edward. There was never a time when Winchester was captured, and there certainly wasn't this idiotic siege, if I can even call it that we see in the show, which is a great shame because it makes Edward seem like a rash idiot, when in actual fact he conquered East Anglia, he started to push forward into Mercia, and had he lived longer, he might well have gone into Northumbria as well, with this slow advance, this capturing of these bwyri, the submission of these armies, and then refortifying the area. And that's led some people to say that it was one of medieval Europe's most remarkable and sustained military comebacks. This was Edward pushing north. It's really the transition from the kingdom of the Anglo-Saxons into the kingdom of the English, because at this point it was no longer capturing land for Wessex that had belonged to Wessex before. It was conquering new territories in East Anglia and further, and that would ultimately lead to, under his son, the creation of this state, this polity that starts to become known as England, even though he loses it right after his death. But anyway, it annoyed me a little bit that they showed Edward in this light, because I read the book on Edward, which is by Michael John Key, came out last year. I'd highly recommend it if you are interested in him. He's a lot less well known than his father Alfred, of course, but I think he deserves to get a lot more recognition for what he did. And I hope that in the next season that potentially what they were doing is they tried to play him down a bit this season so that they can complete his character arc, so to speak, and see the improvement in the next season. Because, well, if these events are happening, sort of 9/11, 9/12, 9/13, that's the start of his first campaign against the Danelaw, and it was a hugely successful campaign. There's some really interesting things that go on, as you can read in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is what my Anglo-Saxon history professor said to us, that you can read it best in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and get a narrative from that. So I would recommend doing that and seeing where Æthelflæd is building Bwyd and where Edward is and what they're capturing. But anyway, I hope this has been somewhat interesting. Let me know if it was. If you'd like more Last Kingdom content, please do let me know in the comments below, and I'd be happy to oblige because I really enjoyed the season and I'd love to nerd out about some more. But anyway, until then, stay safe, stay happy. This has been The History, and I'm, of course, Hilbert.